Hi, I'm Tim. Welcome to Watchbox, and thanks for logging on. So this is a recorded show, but in deference to the fact that you guys often make this scheduled viewing, I have brought back a couple of our previous fan favorites for an extravaganza. This will be our first recorded show in a while, but undoubtedly our best ever. Let's jump straight into the clickbait. You guys saw an Audemars Piguet Jumbo, and I want to oblige you because we've got a Jumbo on the table tonight. Now this is an interesting one because it was the first reference 15202ST. The model came out in 2000 and it ran until 2011. A few differences between this and the watch currently in the catalog include a dial that is distinctly different. You can see there are Arabic numerals outboard of shortened baton-style indices. There is an AP logo at 12 rather than 6, and you can see that the date disc is not monotone blue, but it is in fact white silver. So just from the dial side, you know you're looking at an older version of the 15202. I'll also mention that in 2012, when the current generation of this watch debuted, we saw a change in the dial manufacture. Historically, it had been put together by Stern Frere, which today is a Richemont-owned company. Audemars Piguet brought the patisserie and grand patisserie production in-house. So this is the Petit Grand, is on the standard 15400. It's cut on a pantograph. Now that 19th century lathe engine, a mimicry engine that recreates the pattern from a larger template, is all executed inside of Audemars Piguet. So they're making the hobnail tapisserie dial, and they're also galvanizing them now. The blue, as ever, remains the rarest offering among the mainstream colorations, and because the rejection rate, high then, high now, remains one of the limiting factors, you'll only see this style in AP boutiques or premier retailers. Now, I thought ahead. I brought a polishing cloth. Let's throw this one on the wrist and I'll show you a few more differences. You can see that the previous generation of clasp, the polished logo style, featured a previous generation of trigger, which is a single retractable trigger for opening up the clasp. You'll also note, and let's get real close to the case back here, that the rotor was different in the original 15202, and in my opinion, it was better in the original 15202. This is freehand skeletonized with every inward-facing surface mirror beveled. It's executed in a lovely gold with mirrored bevels, satin finished hoods, and you can see the AP logo in exquisite Baroque carved font. I love this case back, and I dearly miss that rotor on the current generation of the 15202. Now you can also see this is the constant in the Jumbo. You have that gorgeous Jaeger-LeCoultre derived caliber 2121, ultra thin with the date on this watch. This version is 3.05 millimeters thick. You can see that there's a ring that runs all the way around the movement, and that ring is made of beryllium. The rotor sits on top of it, and at all four corners there are ruby rollers that protect that exceptionally low sunken ring and rotor from coming in contact with the actual bridges and plates. It's a smart system, and I should mention that that movement, the 920, formed the basis for calibers used by Patek Philippe, Vacheron, and Audemars Piguet. The same basic movement powered the original Nautilus 3700. Now you can see this is a very flat watch. Extra thin by name, extra thin in fact. As I measure it, 8.1 millimeters thick, 39 millimeters. I will mention the watch wears more like a 41 or a 42 even on the wrist, just because it is so broad with the integration of lug and links. It's a handsome piece though, and it would be my first choice among AP options if I were to go in the Audemars Piguet direction. This is a wonderful watch for anyone's collection, whether you have an AP theme or not. Okay, jumping back, I realized that we should probably do a quick wrist check. I take it for granted that you guys know about my Zin Easy M11, but this is a lovely watch, 500-piece limited edition, a tribute to the 1990s Easy M1. That one was titanium and 40 millimeters. This one is tegmented, face-hardened steel and 43 millimeters. It's still a lefty chronograph. It still has a bidirectional rotating timing bezel. It is still robustly loomed. The main challenge being that the old Lemania 5100 was discontinued long before this tribute model arrived in 2017, so Zin re-engineered a Valjoux 7750 to create the SZ01. You can see that ghosted SZ01 adjacent to 9 o'clock on the dial. So you have radial 60 minutes display at center as well as 60 seconds. So a twin register chronograph with radial indication. If you're wondering what AR means, it means originally filled with argon back in the day. It's now filled with nitrogen, and there is also a copper sulfate capsule on the flank that will pull any additional moisture out of the watch. It's a remarkably smart watch, but it's not a smart watch. All right, jumping back into the box, We've got so much cool stuff on the table tonight, but we may as well talk about an old flame of mine, Jaeger-LeCoultre. Now, this is a brand that, I'm not going to lie, has been through some tough times in recent years. The heyday of modern JLC was during the 90s and the 2000s. First, the resurrection of the brand with the complicated reversos in the 90s, the Grand Memovox, the arrival of the first multifunction reversos, and then in the 2000s with high horology. The high point of high horology being the 2007 Duomet chronograph. 42 millimeters in rose gold. This is part of the original series, and you can see it features the original conical rather than domed bezel profile in the 42 millimeter case. Two mainspring barrels, 50 hours of power reserve from each, driving two separate drivetrains that intersect at the balance. So two separate drivetrains and the balance and the escapement acting as a traffic cop, switching the power between the time and the chronograph alternately. Now it is a mono pusher, so you can see right below my finger the four crenellated towers of the column wheel and the levers that interact with it. You can also see the hammer falling on the reset heart cams at center. Now turn it all back over and you can see it is a remarkably lively machine. You have a Foudroyant 1/6 of a second dial, you have chronograph seconds and center seconds both, two power reserve indicators, and then a mono counter with both chronograph minutes, chronograph hours, and a third indication, single digit chronograph minutes. Throw this one on the wrist, you can see it's fairly large, about 50 millimeters across the wrist. I would say this is one of the larger dress complications you'll encounter, but it's gorgeous inside and out. You can see the double finish of the case flank with those welded on lugs polished and the case flank itself in satin. You can also see the double row knurling of the crown, which has a lovely raised polished JL logo in relief and a blasted center. This is an extraordinary watch with no detail overlooked, and it's even built a little bit like a Longa with the use of the German silver or the nickel copper zinc alloy that has that wonderful golden hue, and the Côte de Soleil exploding out from the imaginary center point of the balance. Having showed you a watch that's built like a Longa, I do feel some pressure to answer with the real thing. This is the 2016 A Lange und Sonne Saxonia Moonphase, 40 millimeters in white gold. The dial is made of solid silver, and the moonphase itself is actually made of solid white gold, and it is then blued by chemical deposition to create the cosmos on top of the gold disc. Now, the watch features a pusher for the date that allows you to rapidly and eagerly, if you're me, cycle through simply for the fun of it. It has the same tactile response as a fine column wheel chronograph, one might even say as a datograph. Turn it all over, and we've got an automatic caliber with a 3-day power reserve. This is the L086, and you'll note that it features all of those Longa design hallmarks that I referenced with the JLC. You've got the German silver bridges, the nickel copper zinc with their golden copper content. You've got a freehand engraved half bridge for the balance, and a black polished swan's neck on top of the balance with a black polished cap on the escape wheel. Blued screws, you can see at center, you have a rotor that combines gold and platinum, as the mass itself is made of platinum and fixed to the rotor with blued screws. A handsome 40 millimeter watch. It's not a traditionally sized dress timepiece because at 40 millimeters it's fairly large for a dress watch, but it is wonderfully flat and easy to wear underneath the cuff. A very versatile timepiece. As long as you don't need to go swimming, I can't imagine you would ever want to take it off. Let's talk about a watch for those who will go swimming. In fact, let's talk about another JLC. This is a watch that I've warmed up to a bit. I'm still not high on the Polaris collection from last year's SIHH, but I think this is one of the best entries in the collection. Now, the Polaris collection that came out last year was designed to mark 50 years since the definitive 1968 Jaeger-LeCoultre Polaris, which featured indices, hands, and numerals, as well as a case form and a size, very similar to this Polaris Date 42 millimeters in stainless steel. It is a diver, 200 meters water resistant, and it features a special dial as only the Polaris Memovox and the Polaris Date from this new generation of the watch feature that ecru simulated patina lume. I don't like fauxtina, and I'll be open and honest and consistent about my position on that. I do think when it's a handsome complementary color, it's appropriate for color's sake, but I don't like the fake torn jeans, the fake faded t-shirts, or the fauxtina dials. except when the color is attractive objectively, and that it is right here. The watch is fairly slim in profile. It's powered by JLC 899, and you can see how they've achieved that plexiglass-like crystal profile, more vintage evocative cues using a box section sapphire. Twin crowns, you can see that the top crown actually rotates the internal bidirectional rotating diving bezel, and it's a very convenient way of timing 0 to 60. I prefer this to a chronograph. It's a heck of a lot easier to read. You can also see to good advantage the sunburst center of the dial, the matte finished frosted hour track, and the metallic matte bezel outboard. So this is a remarkably nuanced dial. All of the indices and numerals are applique metal, so the impression of quality is high. Turn it all over, and of course, you can see the image of the diving helmet as featured on the original super compressor cases. The Piguet super compressor cases used on many dive watches from many brands, but only the Vulcain and the Jaeger-LeCoultre featured alarm. Okay, so that's a wonderful historically evocative piece. Let's talk about something that is bolt upright to the minute contemporary. This is a watch that was a 2018 model year launch, but it was actually first shown in late 2017, and it is the Omega Speedmaster Moonwatch Blue Side of the Moon. Now you can see it is a big watch, 44.25 millimeters, but just under 50 millimeters lug to lug. So I can actually wear this across my relatively narrow wrist. And I'll also say, as the watch is made principally of sapphire and ceramic, both of which are relatively diffuse and very light on the wrist, it's a lightweight watch to wear. Now you can see the flashing zirconium oxide blue ceramic dial with white gold hands and white gold indices. This is a flagship piece for Omega. The blue giving you the fade resistance, resistance to oxidation, and the glossy, lustrous gleam of enamel, but without the cost and fragility of enamel. You'll also note that the watch features a rather realistic moon phase inset on its moon phase crescent. It is a chronograph. It is a coaxial chronometer, and right here you can see that the movement itself is quite a thing to see. This is a master chronometer, 9904, full balance bridge, twin barrels, free sprung balance for shock resistance, silicone hairspring for anti-magnetism, all of this with a 60-hour power reserve. And the nice thing is you can look, turn it so you can see, but underneath the skeletonized bridge for the column wheel, you can actually see the column wheel indexing underneath its bridge. It is both a column wheel and a vertical clutch, so this is a very crisp system and a very steady one, as there is no jump when you start the chronograph on the dial side. You can also leave the chronograph running if you do happen to have such an inclination. You can have center minutes, hours, and seconds and just disregard the chronograph registers. This might be my favorite of the Moon. I love the gray side, I love the blue side. It would be a toss-up between them. Okay, now if you want something that's a bit more classical than the Omega, and perhaps more historically authentic than the Fotina JLC Polaris, you have to consider a Rolex Submariner, a vintage Rolex Submariner. 1978 serial. This is a Rolex Submariner Date 1680 and a remarkably intact example. You can see that is true tritium patina on the dial, and the watch even features its original tritium hands. You can see there's no oxidation, there's no fading, there are no errant marks from bad watchmaking, absolutely no debris, all of the indices intact. And if you look at the watch, so too is the case metal. It is rare to see a sub over 40 years old with this much of its original factory lug bevels intact. This watch strikes me as an example that was rarely, if ever, refinished, as almost all of the original factory metal is present and correct. You can see how crisp that bevel still is. Give me an unrefinished, unpolished watch that is all factory steel over an immaculate, refinished watch any day of the week. You'll even appreciate the fact that when you look at the watch head on, all four lugs are completely symmetrical in shape and volume. Now you throw this one on the wrist, by the way, it is a 93150 bracelet with 580 end links. It's got a full presence. It looks bigger than a typical 39mm vintage sub simply because it hasn't been blasted, sanded, refinished, and diminished down to toothpick lugs. Everything is wonderfully intact, present, and correct. Even the plexiglass, which I will admit is a service replacement Rolex plexiglass, but even that is full and shapely. This is a great way to own a vintage Rolex without any real compromise. My only caution would be don't treat it like a hardcore diver. It's a vintage watch. Other than that, no compromise. You want to compare Fotina, by the way, to real patina? Let's look at them side by side and see how well JLC hit its mark. I have to say, all things considered, they did a pretty good job of emulating that tone. But then again, this is a remarkable Rolex. Not every patina dial is this clean, this deep, this intense, or this even. All right. We have more fun on the table, but first I want to talk about a great way to get into a luxury watch if you want a daily driver and you don't want to G-Shock it. Let's talk about what you can get in the world of luxury quartz. Let's talk about a reasonable size, a durable watch, and a great brand name from a core model line. Omega Seamaster Aqua Terra Quartz, 38.5 millimeters with an anthracite teak deck striated dial. This is a wonderful way to get into a true luxury product for around $2,000. So you can wash the dog, you can go gardening, you can work on the pool filter, all those things you do around the house that are inappropriate for the Nautilus in your life. This is exactly the watch. 3-year power reserve, quartz precision. I want to say this is a timepiece that in many ways the luxury enthusiast can embrace, as this is the antithesis of disposable quartz. This is a timepiece that is a forever watch, but also gives you the peace of mind knowing that it's neither particularly shock susceptible, nor is it going to require any kind of attention. It'll just keep ticking away. Throw it in your safe, pull it out 3 months later, it's still ticking. Take it off your wrist for a weekend, put it on Monday, or vice versa. It's still ticking. Quartz does have its privileges, and accuracy of approximately 10 to 15 seconds a month is another one of them. It's a wonderful watch, only 45.5 millimeters lug to lug. It wears incredibly well on a small wrist. This is a model that came out in 2013. It still looks and feels contemporary. All steel and a great buy. Again, that's for those who don't want to slum it with a Timex Ironman. Now, let's talk about a timepiece that represents the opposite of that. German rather than Swiss, dress rather than sports, mechanical rather than quartz. Let's talk about the 2003 Glasuta Original Panamatic Lunar. 39 millimeters in platinum. This watch, as you can see, was a limited series from that year that marked the debut of this remarkable complication and the caliber that lies within. You can see this was the original duplex swan's neck caliber before the inverse watches. The system debuted on flagship complications. You have a double black polished swan's neck adjustment system, 2 freehand engraved halves to the bridge, and then a 3/4 rotor inside a pocket watch style 3/4 bridge. All of this in platinum, exceptionally heavy on the wrist with a beautifully detailed dial. And I have to say, this is interesting because it's one of the few GO Panorama Datum watches, the Panorama Datum generally using a pusher adjuster, but this is one of the few that has a quick set system, so you can rapidly adjust the date. The pusher adjuster is for the moon phase. It's one of the few Panorama Datum watches with a quick set function. A lovely watch. I'll throw it on the wrist. Perfect size to fit any wrist, and I would imagine any taste, as the combination of the black dial and the white metal case is wonderfully universal. You can wear this with anything. And if we zoom out a little bit to give scale, you can really see how well this one wears. Relatively thin too, just over 13 millimeters, a lovely piece. Now, let's talk about something from the other side of the world. Let's talk about the SBGR 257. This is a relatively recent and uncommon Grand Seiko automatic, a timepiece that's actually 39.4 millimeters in steel. It's neither here nor there, which is to say it's not the 9S case that we know and love, nor is it the 44GS polyhedron case. Rather, this watch is a sort of fusion of the two. Look at the faceting of those lugs. Let me bring in the polishing cloth for remedial polish, or I should say remedial fingerprint. Now you can see the sharpness of those lug ends. They are like cut gems. That is the tin plate Zaratsu manual finish, black polish truly, but it's also been rendered on those faceted crown guards. So this is an extraordinary case and a unique one in the Grand Seiko catalog. Throw the watch on the wrist. It's all in stainless steel. 3-day power reserve. It's a 9S caliber. Automatic winding, water resistant. The timepiece features a screw down crown. It's a sports watch look, but with dress watch elegance. And at 39.4, and yes, it's 39.4 per Grand Seiko. An easy watch to wear and a lovely way to get into Grand Seiko with a timepiece that's not terribly idiosyncratic. It's unusual, it's individual, but it's also universal in its appeal. And that's not the only Grand Seiko on the table tonight, because I have an old friend that is coming back. The legendary and fairly recent SBGA 259 Golden Snowflake. Technically, the Grand Seiko Spring Drive Automatic SBGA 259. A timepiece that is 41 millimeters in titanium. Now, this is that This is that banana-like 9S inspired case form. Definitely not the 44GS polyhedron. Nevertheless, what's in here is a 9R caliber. Spring drive automatic, 3-day power reserve. What really sets this watch apart isn't just that Zaratsu polish on the case, which this watch also has, but it's the dial. If we can get super close to the dial, you can see the rusticated ridges and drifts. You can see where it's gathered, where it waxes and wanes. It has a three-dimensional quality to it, like the snowdrifts outside of Grand Seiko's northern Japan studios that build these watches. And I should mention, snowflake is an appellation bestowed by the makers of the watch. It's not a collector nickname. You'll also note the true golden, hand-polished, faceted, and hand-applied indices and Dauphine-style hands. The hand finish of Grand Seiko dials, both the dial bases, the indices, and the remainder of the dial furniture, represent one of the most undersold advantages of the brand. And you can see that smooth, sweeping spring drive hand. There are no stops, there are no stutters. It's not 8 beats per second, 10 beats per second, or any number of beats per second. It's a unidirectional governing wheel that creates a unique smooth sweep. It's basically quartz precision at plus or minus 15 seconds per month, but with mechanical soul, as there are no motors, no batteries, no capacitors. The mainspring, hence spring drive, is the only source of energy or motion in the watch. And if you look through the case back, you can see the unidirectional rotating governing wheel that actually creates the induced electromagnetic current that allows the system to speed up and slow down. It also creates an induced current that wakes up the quartz oscillator inside the watch to use that back EMF, the electromagnetic force, to govern the speed of the wheel. If it goes too fast, more electromagnetic force will slow it down. If it slows too much, the magnetic force ebbs and it speeds up. Incredibly accurate, 3-day power reserve, stop seconds, quick set date, and perhaps one of the modern masterpieces at Grand Seiko, one of the essential Grand Seiko models. If you're into the brand or thinking of getting into the brand, any snowflake, that one golden or conventional, needs to be on your list. Let's talk about Rolex again. Let's talk about an early A-series Explorer 2, 16570. This is a watch that represents the old 40mm Explorer 2, which for a lot of folks was the last great Explorer 2. While I like the 42 and it would be my preference with the polar dial, a lot of folks want the most traditional possible Explorer 2. And short of going back and picking up a Steve McQueen, this is going to be one of the best ways to get in. A watch that at 21 years old, 22 years old, is a good example of emerging vintage. So you can call this your vintage Rolex, but it's not so old that you can't wear it like a modern watch. It still makes its 100-meter water resistance. It still has a sapphire crystal. It still has a high beat movement. It's still a chronometer. It still features dual time, not the 12-24 coupled drive of the original Steve McQueen 1655. This is a watch that represents a true dual time, modern function Rolex Explorer 2, but with the old style 40mm case and now working on its third decade. This is a watch that can be called vintage. I'm going to throw it on my wrist and show you just how this wears. Now, of course, this is old school. This is hollow end links, hollow center links, and as you can see, prior to 2003, we had perforated lugs on our Rolex sports watches. So you can see that this, Daytona accepted, of course, you can see this one has those strap tool apertures in case you want to throw the watch on a strap. It's easier to take the bracelet off on this timepiece. You'll also appreciate the fact that it's a relatively flat watch, and because it's not a rotating bezel Rolex sports watch, it wears better if you want to double it up as your dress watch. So a very versatile watch, a wearable size, and for a lot of folks, the Explorer 2 to own if you're going to own an Explorer 2. We'll stay with the vintage Rolex theme, and now we're talking about a 1991 GMT Master II. This one's I've got a little piece of tape there. This one is a GMT Master II 16710, and we have the original chronometer card warranty with this watch, and the original warranty card and paperwork attests that this 1991 GMT Master II Coke was born with the Jubilee bracelet. That's correct. It was born with the Jubilee bracelet. That is confirmed in the reference number of the watch on its chronometer certificate. So it's not just that we have a remarkably preserved watch, and you can see how even and full those lugs are. This one is as extraordinary as that Submariner with the factory bevels present and correct, and you can see them really well there. It's not just a period bracelet on a matching period serial watch. It's not just that both are in excellent condition, it's that the two were born together. Now I'm going to turn this one around and show you the other side of the lug, so you can see that all four corners of this one retain those original factory bevels, and all four corners remain immensely full and symmetrical from side to side and end to end. You'll also note that the dial, hands, and indices all original tritium, and this one has a wonderful fade featuring the later white gold hands and white gold indices. You saw the sub from the 70s. Now you're looking at what a Rolex dial would have looked like back in 1991. So you have all white gold indices and hands, a black lacquered dial base, but all of this original, and you can see the timepiece in outstanding condition. This one has been minimally fettled, and I'm a huge fan. A timepiece that frankly represents an opportunity for someone to get into a watch, rarely if ever refinished, as close as you can get to the way it left Geneva, with the addition of a few scratches and scuffs. But if you ask me, do I want refinished and shiny or factory metal, 10 times out of 10, I want factory metal. And of course, the Jubilee always available up until the super case GMT Master in 2005, but always the minority option. Most people historically opted for, through the decades, a strap or the Oyster Bracelet. So that's a very special piece right there. I'm also going to jump into a watch that in a lot of ways represents what an offshoreized version of a Gerald Genta Ingenieur would have looked like. We know what the Royal Oak originally looked like, and we know what a Royal Oak offshore looks like. If you were to apply the same treatment to Gerald Genta's 1976 Jumbo Ingenieur that Emmanuel Guet applied to the original Royal Oak, you would wind up with an Ingenieur that looks like this. The 2013 Ingenieur AMG Black Series Black Ceramic. It is a 46mm black ceramic Ingenieur with the Genta style case that has been upsized and upgraded. It is named after AMG Mercedes' most formidable series, the Black Series. There's AMG and then there's AMG Black Series, and this nearly scratch-proof manufacturer movement 46 is named after the latter. Now I should also mention that the timepiece features IWC's own movement. This is IWC caliber 80110, so this 2013 series, 120 meters water resistant, does not feature a customer caliber. It has the Peloton pawl-based winding system, which you can see just underneath my finger. You can see the pawl, you can see the pawl wheels in gold, and you can get a good view of that system. So this one is all IWC, and I have to mention that this has been one of the most successful partnerships, as Mercedes-AMG in F1 has gone from strength to strength to strength. IWC must be thanking its lucky stars it signed up with Mercedes-AMG back in 2005 instead of McLaren. I'll also throw this one on the wrist to show you that it's not quite as scary on a small wrist as the 46mm Big Pilot. The Big Pilot is bonkers. This you could actually wear on a smaller wrist. I don't know if I'd want to wear it on a smaller wrist than mine, but you can see it's not outlandishly huge, and it doesn't flare out the way a Big Pilot does, partly because the case form itself is arced down around the wrist, and the lugs themselves are almost not there. A lovely watch, and this is one for those of us who hate scratches and scuffs. We have another one for those of us who love ceramic cases, but perhaps don't have the wrist to pull off an AMG. Well, you don't necessarily need to drive your watch, and you don't necessarily need to fly your watch, but between driving and diving, we've seen some of the coolest sports watches ever made. And this right here is the coolest Omega of 2019. We go away from AMG and driving to diving with the Seamaster Diver 300-meter black ceramic. This came out in January, and frankly, it was the first and most interesting of the 2019 Omega launches. Sure, there have been a couple of Moonwatch tributes, and I promise you there will be more in July, but this is a timepiece that captivates me. 43.5mm in black ceramic with titanium bezel and titanium hardware. The watch has a ceramic dial to match with a no-date layout, so it's symmetrical and unbroken, and for a lot of folks, this is the one to own. It's not excessively broad across the wrist. I could say you probably wear this watch on a wrist as small as 15 centimeters circumference, maybe 14.5, because with titanium and ceramic, it is super light, and it's probably the best of the Diver 300 meters. I can see why this watch didn't come out last year. It would have outshined the 42, and probably have been the #1 watch in demand, to the detriment of the mainstream steel models. So this is probably Omega's coolest watch of the year, and I will say it's my favorite new Omega of 2019. Let's take a look at an Omega that came out in 2016. This is an Aqua Terra. It's an Aqua Terra Good Planet. So there were a couple of Good Planet editions in 2016, and this one right here, 38.5 millimeters in titanium with blue index white lacquer dial. It's just so easy to wear. It's only about 45 millimeters across the wrist, and in titanium, it feels like it's barely there. It's 150 meter water resistant. The blue and the white combination is awesome. The case back revealing 60-hour coaxial chronometer caliber 8500. You can see that the 8500 is a good-looking movement. I'm not going to lie, mechanically finished, but mechanically finished to a handsome design, dominated by those spiral Côte de Genève in arabesque and blackened screws. A good-looking watch that's also effectively amagnetic. They say anti-magnetic, but when you're over 15,000 Gauss, it's all academic. This is an amagnetic watch. It's also the Surf Turf Seamaster, so you can take this one in the boardroom, the boardwalk. You can jump off the dock at the yacht club, go out in the surf. This would look equally appropriate in the dining hall at the yacht club. And if you're like me and you've never been a member of a yacht club or a country club, this is a way to rough it at the beach this summer and elbow your way onto the surf at a Memorial Day holiday cookout at Jones Beach, Robert Moses, or Montauk Point. This thing is awesome, and it'll fit any wrist. It's a great watch if you have a smaller wrist. It's a unisex option, and it is a no-compromise watch, mechanically and hermetically identical to the larger Aqua Terras. Now, let's talk about a watch that takes us back in the direction of driving. I think it's important to always talk about Chopard on occasion because we talk about Rolex, Patek, and AP to death, but Chopard has offered some of the best watches in segment for over 20 years. Now, this is not one of their manufacture movements, but it's one of their most characteristic sports watches. This is emblematic of the brand, as Chopard has been involved in the modern Mille Miglia road rally since the late 1980s. This is a Mille Miglia chronograph, all of titanium. You can see on my wrist, it's an easy 40 millimeters to wear. This one was part of a Racing Colors series of 1,000-piece color dial chronometer chronographs that came out in 2007, and this one is French Racing Blue. It's a deep lustrous blue lacquer, and it contrasts beautifully with the satin silver of the track outboard, the Rayhaut flange, as well as the brighter snailed silver of the sunken registers. Turn it all over, you can see individual numbering on the case back. It's an ETA 2894 42-hour vertical clutch 2892 based modular chronograph, but it is COSC certified, and as you can see, it has a very handsome aesthetic about it. It's balanced, it's beautifully sized, it's beautifully proportioned, and the colors are exuberant. They pop off the dial. They're redolent of the fun of motorsports. And if you're into the Mille Miglia, you're probably into vintage cars and old school road rallies. So this watch is one for the drivers who don't necessarily have Audemars Piguet, Patek Philippe, Vacheron, Lange money, who aren't going to line up at the start of the automotive Tour de France or the Le Mans Heritage event with a Richard Mille on the wrist. This is a way to get a driver's chronograph on your wrist at a reasonable price with impeccable breeding and tremendous durability and precision. Okay, and for those of you who do have Patek Philippe money, we've got a Patek Philippe, two in fact. Let's talk about the more universal of the two. I have a feeling this is going to be the crowd pleaser because the Nautilus annual calendar is one of the watches of the moment. Now this example is on the rarely seen brown rubber Patek Philippe strap, and note that Patek uses a lovely consonant écrou stitch rather than a standard white contrast. 40.5 millimeters in stainless steel. It's an annual calendar. It's a gray anthracite gradient dial, so it's actually lighter at its center than it is at its edge. The 40.5 millimeter steel watch, of course, being a prestige complication for Patek, since the Nautilus is the company's design icon and the annual calendar is Patek's own invention. The first one was created in 1996. It was the 5035. That was the first ever annual calendar. It was Patek's idea. Now this watch is very swimmable. On the rubber strap, 120 meters water resistant. You can see the caliber 324 automatic through the case back. Silicone hairspring, free sprung balance, 35 to 45 hour power reserve, and beautifully finished. You can see the mirrored chamfer on the edge of the bridges. You can see the engine turning on the base plate, the center of the rotor, and if you look carefully, you can even see the reduction wheel of the winding system. That even has micro engine turning on its face. Perfectly aligned, abrasive wheel laid Côte de Genève across the bridges, and black polished screws. Granted, the 324 is getting long in the tooth as a movement, but it's as precise and beautiful as it's ever been, and it's still one of the standards of the industry in that regard. This is the Nautilus annual calendar on a strap, a brown rubber strap, which you'll note is designed to emulate the leather because it has a lighter color on the underside. So in a lot of ways, this is a stealth rubber strap. It's designed to look like leather. A dial that's beautifully balanced, better balanced in fact, than the 5712 moon phase or the date style 5711, as this is a dial you could split down the middle and achieve perfect symmetry. Now, I lied. We have 3 Patek Philippes on the table. If you don't want to go with an annual calendar with a center rotor, perhaps a micro rotor perpetual calendar. This is a model released in 2003. This example was sold in 2004. It's the 5136 1G in white gold, 37 millimeters in white gold. It is a true perpetual calendar and quite slender, under 10 millimeters thick with a domed bezel. 37 millimeters means anyone can wear this watch, and you can see across the wrist, it's very narrow. It's not a broadly slung watch. The case profile itself wraps nicely around the wrist, and I'll actually endorse this for a wrist as small as 13 to 13.5 centimeters circumference. This is a great way to get into a complicated Patek with a traditional size. And if you do have that smaller wrist like mine, you're going to favor this watch. Through the case back, you can see Patek's premium automatic. This isn't the 324 anymore. This is the 240. A micro rotor. You get the advantage of seeing everything. There's no winding bridge covering the movement. There's no rotor covering half the movement. The rotor is also in the same plane as the bridges, so you can see how the watch is as thin as a manual wind. Old school Geneva hallmark. You can see the crest just up on the edge of the barrel and train bridge. You have that beautiful engine turning across the base plate. You have Côte de Genève on the bridges, but also the 22 karat gold winding mass. Black polished screws. You still have the Gyromax free sprung balance. This one's adjusted in 5 positions like a chronometer and absolutely gorgeous. You can see the sinks for the jewels are all mirror finished in their own right by hand. This is as good as it gets in the world of Patek Perpetuals. That said, some folks prefer a more nostalgic style. And for those folks, there is the 36 millimeter, launched 1998, Patek Philippe 5059R. Retrograde perpetual calendar. You've got your day, you've got your leap year phase, you've got your month, and then you've got a retrograding date at center with a moon phase down at 6 o'clock that has a 122-year accuracy interval. You have the lugs designed to evoke the officers' watches of World War I, when pocket watches would feature soldered-on lugs and simple bars fixed to retain a strap so that officers in the trenches could easily reference the watches on their wrist rather than fumbling with their clothes or inside their jackets, especially when chemical weapons gear was being worn. So this is a nod to a brutal period of world history, but also the formative age of the wristwatches. That was truly the beginning of mass adoption of the wristwatch. The First World War had a big impact on that. And because the originals were often converted from pocket watches with hunter-style cases, this officer-style perpetual calendar has a half-hunter case back. You can see the 315, the 21/6 beat predecessor to the 324. It's beautifully finished, and it too features the Poinçon de Genève signature. Close it all up, and you can see that the watch does have a little pot-bellied profile like an old pocket watch converted into a wristwatch. Throw this one on the wrist, and you can see the 36 really does wear quite easily. This is compact, complicated watchmaking, and it's even shorter across the wrist than the 5136 we just saw. So this is a great way to get into complications. If you're a woman with a taste for men's watches, or you're a man with a taste for traditional sizes, or like me, you're a man with a smaller wrist, and a beautiful piece too. You'll even note the plinth underneath the crown, also evocative, along with the onion profile of the crown of old school pocket watches. Our time is growing short, so what could possibly conclude a show like this? Well, quite frankly, this is one of the only shows I've ever held where we have actually run the table and we've shown every reference save 2. The first, Rolex Oyster Perpetual Date. More vintage Rolex, this one true vintage Rolex, 1974 serial with a spectacular champagne gray dial. Note the double signature at 6 o'clock. It is both a Sigma dial with the A Prior Swiss Gold Trade Association marks, the so-called Sigma. Those are also known as the A Prior marks for the acronym for that Swiss trade organization from the 70s, which was trying to promote the use of gold on watch dials. And then you have the T, which signifies a tritium dial, and it is a tritium dial. Hands and indices, all of them beautifully and naturally faded. The dial is spotless with no loose lume, no missing lume, and no signs of wear or adverse handling. It's a 34mm case with a lovely dome profile plexiglass, and the timepiece is a reference 1500. So this is an old school watch with a period matching bracelet. The bracelet is actually dated 1976 and it is a 78350. So I'm going to throw this one on the wrist and show you how easy it can be to get into vintage Rolex. The date has always been the 34mm counterpart of the Datejust with the same movement, same quality of bracelet and clasp, same quality of dial, and you can see this is an incredible watch. If you want a vintage Rolex that doesn't cost an arm and a leg and will fit on an arm that isn't the size of a leg, this is a great way to get into a nice size that looks the business. It's iconic Rolex Oyster case design, and it fits on a smaller wrist like mine. I might actually pick this over a Datejust from the same period, especially when the condition is taken into account, and that dial with its double signature and its even lume fade is extraordinary. But I finish with a crescendo, and what a crescendo, because this might be my favorite watch. It's between the Duomet, the Blue Side, and the ceramic Seamaster tonight, and this thing. This thing is wild. For 2018, FP Journe went big and did something he had never done hitherto. He split his seconds in a sports watch, and this is the FP Journe Line Sport Chronograph Monopoussoir Rattrapant, a timepiece, 44mm in platinum, full platinum bracelet with hammered finish. How gorgeous is that? The rubber bumpers are there to protect the hammered finish, and I kind of like the two-tone effect it achieves. The dial is a blue mauve that is exclusive to the platinum model, and you can see it features white gold bezel for the sub-registers, white gold primary hands, and white gold Arabic numerals. It has a lovely pyramid-style hobnail at center, and the tachymeter outboard is actually ceramic. All of this on an FP Journe factory bracelet made by FP Journe. It has incredible heft. Throw it on the wrist, and first let me show you how it works, because you may be wondering, why am I calling it a mono pusher when it appears to have twin triggers? Well, the mono pusher starts, resets, stops, and restarts. If you use what appears to be the reset trigger, or would be a reset trigger on a conventional chronograph, you split the second, and thereby turn this into a mono pusher rattrapant. You'll also note that for the first time since the old octa chronograph, we've got a useful date and a double-digit date on an FP Journe chronograph watch. Turn it all over, and you can see caliber 1518. Over 33mm in diameter. This is a solid rose gold movement. Manual wind, 80-hour power reserve. You can see 2 column wheels. You can see the levers and horns interacting with the column wheels. You can see, as I start, stop, and reset, those recentering hammers falling at center, and you can see the black polished bridge. Let me grab my polishing cloth real quick, but you can see the black polished bridge for the chronograph's rattrapant mechanism right underneath my finger. That bridge is black polished and mirror chamfered. All of the levers for the chronograph feature a satin finish. All of the screws feature black polished heads, circular Côte de Genève across the bridges, engine turning on the base plate, and an enormous, huge inertia, free sprung balance beating away at 21.6. Folks, that is the crescendo. That is the final fireworks send-off for our 4th of July Watches Live, Watches Recorded special segment. I cannot top this. All right, this one's got to get back to headquarters, and I've got to take a break. My folks are waiting to get their Independence Day started, and I hope you too are going to experience a safe and happy 4th of July. And for my viewers abroad, I thank you for making the best job in the world possible. Time out, Tim out, where your watch is in great health, and thanks for logging on.